Okay. Yeah. So, hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. Really appreciate you being here. Yeah. So we have a couple of things to go over before we get started with the talk. But again, today's stormy, so if you have to drop the call or anything like that, just join back when you can. No sweat. We understand. Can't help the weather. If you are doing this for your class requirement, make sure to fill out the form in your classroom. You should find instructions on how to do that in your class night. You should be able to ask one of them as well. I'm not super familiar with open class, so I probably can't help you directly, but I'm just reminding you to fill it out. That way you get the credit. Um, in general, though, we have some other guest speakers coming up as well in a couple of weeks. On the 6th of October, we have Joe Kratzat from developer to software engineer from Oracle. We have the remote jobs workshop a couple of weeks after that, so you'll get to see me and then Danny Martin do that if you want to stop through. And then we have a few others in November, everything from sort of recruiting stuff to cybersecurity to data analytics, and sort of starting small and sort of building your own brand in the data analytics space. That's actually a pretty good talk. I've been to that a couple of times. But yeah, without too much else, just sort of keep muted unless you're asking questions or anything at a Q&A. If you have any questions that can just be written down, you can also type them in chat and we'll get to them there too. But yeah, this is Todd Willey. He's an architect at Oracle, has tons of experience with open source, can tell us all kinds of great stuff about it. He's very active in the technology community in the Lexington area, but also just Kentucky wide and nationwide. And we're really happy to have him here.
Yeah, thanks, David, for that intro. Let me just apologize to everyone for the late start, but I think it was worth it to get camera. I hate being in calls without camera, and my other computer had some issues, so thanks for bearing with me. So so tonight I'm going to talk about open source software. If you know what that is, that's awesome. Some of the first part is going to be a little bit boring for you, but maybe it'll be a different view into something you already know a little bit about. If you don't know about it, first few slides, we're building up, might be a little bit confusing, but I promise we'll get there. So like David said, my name is Todd Willey. Why should I be giving this talk, right? That's always the first thing that I want to know. And I think the reason that I'm well suited to talk about open source software is that I have been on a large open source software from its inception. So there was a software called OpenStack. OpenStack is an open source cloud computing platform. So when there was basically only Amazon doing infrastructure as a service, there was an open source one called Eucalyptus, Open Core. We won't actually talk about that today, but it didn't work very well. So we went and we built a new one that was more suited for what we needed to do. And the place that we needed to do that was NASA, like man on the moon, mission to Mars. That NASA needed to get massive amounts of data out to the world, and they needed infrastructure to host and present that data and let their scientists run experiments. And so that's why we started as infrastructure. And because it was NASA, it seemed reasonable, since space is for all mankind. We wanted to make sure that we were able to give back as well, right, with our software side. And so we did that. And we did that by partnering with another company called Rackspace Hosting. And so Rackspace and NASA were the two initial members of what came to be called the Open Infra Foundation, which as of maybe 2 months ago is now part of the Linux Foundation. And so my knowledge of this project was I started as just like a grungy. You can look at me, right? Like I look like a hacker who lives in a basement, and that's because I wish I was a hacker who lived in a basement. But I actually have to do things with other people, right? And I think that was the first learning here for me, was that it took a whole community and a lot of coordinated effort, right? This sort of self-coordinated over mailing list era of open source software is kind of behind us. And so it's very much a team effort. I got to see how the sausage was made from the inside. And so that's why I'm going to talk about open source software. So that was establishing my open source credentials, right? Pretty impressive. However, most of my career has not been contributing to open source software the way that I did when I was a contractor at NASA. I've worked at Oracle for almost 10 years at this point. I've worked a lot of places. My typical job stint was around 3 to 4 years. I'm not going to tell you my age, but I've had lots of jobs at this point, right? And so in every single one of these jobs, I was a user of open source software. And a few of them, I got the opportunity to be a contributor to open source software, to start from scratch and build a new open source software, right? And so having seen it from both sides as a consumer and a producer, I want to make sure that you can get kind of a balanced view, right? So the way we're going to go through this talk today is we're just going to talk about what is open source software, right? We're going to start with the definitional stuff. We're going to talk about software licensing and some legal terms. Then we're going to talk about why do you, as someone in a boot camp or early in your career, why do you care about open source software? And like I said, I've used it everywhere, right? So spoiler alert. And then how will you actually interface with open source in your job, whether it's just individual projects, maintainers, contributing patches, all the different models for how you give back. And then, like any good talk, to show my thought leadership, we're going to speculate wildly about the future, and then we're all going to forget about it and never hold me accountable for the things that I say. So let's just agree to that up front as well, right? So most of the time when people think about open source software, they think about it's the software that you get for free. Right. And I think we're in a golden era of software as a service, right? So this didn't exist early in my career where you can go to Google and get a free email account, right? And it's hosted on the web and you use your web browser to do stuff, right? But before that, even there was just the software that you could get and download off of like SourceForge, which was like the GitHub before GitHub, basically. And so you had all this free stuff, right? And as cool as free stuff is, that's not the only definition of what open source is, right? So having code available is part of it. However, there are also grants of rights that you have that you can do with that code. So you can redistribute it. You can install it on different systems. You can share the source code again with your friends. You can make changes and share those, right? It also comes with explicit obligations, right? So this is my use of software might be that I have to share my patents, or I have to share the code even if I compile the binaries, right? And then there are limitations on the grants that it gave me. It told me I can redistribute it, but it might limit that in some way by saying you can redistribute it, but if you make significant changes, don't use the same name as the parent project. Don't use the names of the other contributors to promote yourself, your own derivative work, as they call it, right? And so all these block of grants, obligations, and limitations, these are called the license, right? And so open source, when we say that, we really mean what license do you have that engages you with the contributors of that code, with that code base, that allows you to do things and gives you obligations that you have to fulfill as well. And so here's one example license. I just want to show the MIT license. This is my favorite one. My only takeaway for you, if you only have one thing, is that if you want to make software and put it out into the world, just license it MIT. Dead simple. Other people can do anything they want with it. And the point here isn't don't worry about the text, right? But it's small enough to fit on a screen, somewhat legibly, I assume, right? And it starts with permission is hereby granted, right? So that's those grants of rights. It says limitations, right? I have to include this copyright in the permission notice. And here are the limitations of, or obligations, right? And then limitations of, hey, bro, you can't sue me, right? Because it's just a hobby project or whatever, right? So don't sue me. You can use it however you want, but make sure you give the copyright notice along with it. And so thinking about where we are today, that I can, hack out some code, put it on GitHub, put the MIT license file in the repository and let everybody use it and go wild and fork it and make patches against it. Where did we come from, right? What is the heritage of open source software? And so every time I give a talk, I like to remind people how young of an industry computing is, right? If we think about Hippocrates and medicine, right, we're talking like thousands of years. If we talk computers, we're talking 100 years. If we talk about Wi-Fi, right, like signals intelligence and signals processing, we're talking, 70-ish years. So there are all these things that we're doing in computing that are like still, the founders and the innovators are, most of them are still alive, right? Like Vint Cerf, who made Ethernet protocol, the base layer of internet, is like, that talks on YouTube, right? This is a great time to be alive. And so since this is such a new industry, right, the way we did things was we had lots of computers because we didn't know what all computers should look like. So before, the PC revolution, it was called in the 80s, where IBM basically said anyone can make something called a PC and Windows can run on it, all this kind of stuff. This standardization hadn't happened yet. And so computers were vastly divergent. So there were research institutions building computers. There were commercial entities building computers. And they'd have different chips and they'd have different ways to arrange things inside the system. The buses where memory and hardware is plugged in and all this stuff look different all over the place. And so how do you make software run in that ecosystem, right? If MIT and Caltech want to run the same software, their computers are vastly different. They're going to have to make some changes to make that software work in a lot of cases. And so that is the genesis, right? Is like computers were hard, and then software on top of computers was very hard. And so the idea was like, I'm not going to make this work for your computer, but I will give you the source code so that you can make it work for your computer. And that wasn't about making new features. It wasn't about contributing back. It was just about get it running, right? And so, early days, you can read about a guy named Richard Stallman who started the GNU project, GNU. He didn't understand that once he had the source code, he wasn't supposed to make changes to it, right? And when he found that out, he got mad. And that's where a lot of the free Libre open source software comes from. We trace the genesis of Linux back to that moment where people wanted to make changes and didn't understand that they shouldn't be allowed to. And so where are we now? We've come a long way. We have this model of licensing. A lot of the licenses have been tested in court and held up to be valid. So it is something stable and substantial that you can actually build a business or a hobby project even around, which is important. And so just to give you the breadth of this, right, there are almost 100 licenses. There are definitely over 80 that the Open Source Initiative calls open source licenses. There are other definitions, right? But I think this is a pretty good one. And so that's a lot over the last, 30 to 40 years of open source software to get to that point. And so we talked about it a little bit before, right? Like the grants, conditions, and limitations. Are you able to build it? Do you have to give code? Can you give object, like compiled things around? Do I have to use the same license when I make a distribution of something, right? Some licenses aren't that way. So if I give you something under Apache, you can relicense it under GPL plus some other conditions, right? So there's some things you can do there. And it's interesting that this is just like people wanting to make their own software better. But all of this open source software now underpins basically everything we do. All the, I'm on a Mac machine right now, but I can run a process called Top, right? And it traces its history back to early Unix in the 70s and 80s, right? So all these things underpin society, underpin the internet, underpin the way we talk to each other, deliver streaming video, all this kind of stuff. And it just started because people want the ability to make changes, to make software more valuable for themselves or for their family, their community, their business, right? And so this wraps up that first part of definitional, right? And so we used to share code ad hoc to get it working on computers. Now we share code with legal grants called a license. Pick the MIT license if you have a choice. And that's the definition of what you may, must, and cannot do. And I will remind you that these are civil agreements between two mutually empowered parties. This is not the government versus you. You're not going to jail if you violate a license, right? So a license is just an agreement between folks. And so, there'll be cease and desist. There'll be, maybe somebody trying to like sue you for monetary damages if you made money off of their product or something like this without sharing it. But I think the big thing to know is like, don't be afraid, because I just said a bunch of legal terms, but do not be afraid about just using open source software in the way you're comfortable with, because you will not go to jail for sure. I am not a lawyer, but for sure. All right, so that's kind of the definitional part of open source. And so the next section is, why do you care about open source? And I think the most important reason is because you are a user of open source software, right? So earlier today, I ran virtual environment space, and then I made a new Python virtual environment. All my Python programmers out there know what this life is like. The Python language itself, the virtual environment package, all of these things are open source software. In fact, most programming languages are open source software, and even the ones that aren't open source software usually have an open source clone. Like if you think about Java, Java is like code available, but not truly open source in terms of taking contributions back. But there are many Java runtime environments that implement the Java protocols and language spec and all these sorts of things. And so if you are a programmer, you are going to be a user, maybe even a power user of a lot of different types of open source software. And just to kind of drive this home, like I've got this LG TV behind me. You guys remember the 3D fad, from, probably 15 years ago? I was all over that. So I've got this sweet 3D TV. And when I opened it up, I saw, half of the instruction manual were copyright and license notices because there's so much open source software in my television with that, limitation that you are, not limitation, what was the other word? You are compelled to give copyright notice and limitation of warranty when you distribute compiled software, right? And so I had all that in my TV book, right? And it's not just in my TV, it's in everything that has a chip in it, basically at this point. I bet your car has some amount of open source software in it as well. And so just to talk about as an industry or as a society, what are the impacts that open source has? There are a couple of incidences that stand out. These two words here, log4shell and heartbleed. Maybe you've never heard of them, but you can Google them and you can get lots of good results back on how expansive and widespread these problems were. So if you can imagine, well, yeah, so if we look at the next problem, right, it's not just an OSS problem, right, on that next line. It says SolarWinds and CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike is probably the most recent one. If you remember, it's been probably within a year that you couldn't book airline tickets because all of the airline companies' computers were down because of this, security system called CrowdStrike pushed a bad update, and the entire world was unable to travel for 2 days while they worked that out, and they had to actually physically go to computers, right? So that's the commercial side. But these other two examples of Log4Shell and Heartbleed are the same sort of problem, but in open source software, where a blatant bug that gets discovered and exploited has a massive impact across the entire industry. And when that happens, you can see exactly how widespread open source software really is. So it's free, right? That was my first thing. Like, we all love free stuff. We used to go get the free code and run it. But everything has costs that are non-monetary, right? And so I want to talk about some deliberate sabotage that has happened to open source projects. So the first one is this LeftPad package. I don't remember what the context was, but the author was unhappy with the maintainers of npm package repository, and they unpublished their package. And so this software, that all it does is, it takes a string and it adds some spaces to the front, because if the word is the, you can pad it to 6 characters long. So it would be space, 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 THE, right? That's the entire package. But everybody used this thing. Everybody who's printing out any kind of table on the command line or anything like this, there were just, LeftPad was used everywhere. So this guy gets mad and unpublishes it, and everybody's build job breaks that day. They're like, hey, my compile is failing. I can't deploy. I went to deploy and it failed, and I'm trying to roll back and it's failing. And that was a bad day as well. There are other cases of this, right? So this colors package, same thing. Somebody just got mad that they were unappreciated as an open source maintainer, and so they just made a hate scroll of like text filling up your screen the whole time that says support open source maintainers or whatever, right? And then also another type of sabotage was geopolitical sabotage. So at the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict a couple of years ago, the developers of Node IPC decided to check if it was running in Russia. I think they were using like the keyboard layout to try to figure this out. And if you were in Russia, it would fill your disk drive with heart emojis, because somehow, that's better than actually taking it offline and with something other than a heart makes it less impactful that you can't get any work done, I guess. And in addition to these like 3 examples of maintainer deliberate sabotage, there are also things where non-maintainers, people that you wouldn't normally trust, do things, right? So, well, I guess the first is just like bugs exist, right? The log4 shell and heartbleed are examples of that. So there's also what's called typo squatting. So imagine this package node IPC is very popular, and I publish one called node ICP, right? Just transverse two of the letters, and now people that are making common typos in their code end up with my bad package that's crypto miner or stealing their bank account credentials or whatever hackers are into these days. And then there's another type of attack, which is gain the confidence of a community, become a maintainer, and then roll out something that's a crypto miner or whatever, right? So there are costs to open source software, even if they are not financial costs. And so because you're using open source software, you have to know, if you're a business especially, right? Like you have to know what are the conditions and limitations of that license. Like one of those is don't sue the maintainers of the software, right? Like you probably didn't have it in your heart to sue those people anyway. But somebody could come to you and ask like, hey, I'd like to know what open source libraries you're using. And if you're using, like FFmpeg to encode video, like I'd like to see your source code. And are you ready to like give over your source code to your customers, right? Like that's a very impactful business decision that you need to have thought about ahead of time. So that's another example of costs, are the costs of both licensing the software and complying with the license sort of at face value, and then sort of the users coming and asking for the source code, right? Those sort of second order effects of choosing that license. And so, like I said, in your hobby project, you're not going to jail. Nobody's going to come at you and ask you for your source code, or you're giving it away for free because you're publishing it open source, right? So you probably don't worry about this in a day-to-day setting of just like going through projects, going through boot camps, like this stuff, like don't worry about any of it, right? But in the corporate world, you're going to have to worry about this. And the way that you're going to have to worry about it, or the way most businesses, meaning their legal teams, and well as their like centralized technical architecture teams, the way they deal with these problems are, one, they limit the licenses you can work with, right? So we just have a blanket, you're not allowed to use the GNU public license, GPL, version 3 or later, or AGPL. There's a list of licenses that would require us to do owner's compliance or open up our intellectual property with other people, and we're just not allowed to do that. The other thing that you're going to do is that you're going to version pin your source code libraries, right? So if you're using Node IPC, you're going to decide, I'm going to use Node IPC version 123, and I'll only update at a very specific time after careful review, not just at the next build if that happens after a new release of Node IPC, right? And so this helps protect you from maintainer attacks and some other types of things. It's make sure there's other people being early adopters and finding bugs and contributing fixes before you have to uptake that release. The last thing, which is probably like very new to a lot of folks, is incident response plans. And so having a full list of what is the software that I'm building from, what is my resulting software, and where is that installed, right? Having that inventory done, let something like the log4 shell happen, and which systems you need to go patch. Which software you need to recompile with an updated library. And you have to subscribe to the email list for all of these packages that you're on, right? So that's part of your selection criteria. Is it licensed well? Is there a well-documented way to get security announcements before they become public and like every script kiddie starts writing exploits against it? And then you're going to limit the versions that you uptake, and probably you're going to mirror that source code into your own code hosting as well to prevent from unpublishing problems, or just npm.org getting a denial of service attack or whatever, right? Just to make it a little bit safer. So it feels like bureaucracy. It's another thing that's slow, but it really does help your customers make sure that you have a continuity of operations across all these ways, that using other people's products, in this case, that product happens to be open source software, but anytime you build on other people's products, you still have a responsibility for safely integrating those products into your product, and that doesn't change in software. So now we've gone through part 2. So part 1 defined what open source software was. Part 2 defined the ways that you're likely to be a consumer and what costs are going to have on open source software that you use. And so just foreshadowing that as you do things in the industry, you're going to have to think a little bit more critically in your job about which libraries and packages that you're using than you have to do currently. So now let's talk about what it means to give back to open source. And so, as we all know, the root word of open source is source, right? So giving that code over to the maintainers and say, hey, I found a compile problem where this didn't run on Windows and now it does because here's my code that made it work, right? So this is patching their code, or offering your code to them through a patch or pull request. And this is what a lot of people think of as the core of open source software, right? However, if you're a rando off the internet and you come to me and tell me to integrate source code into my project that I've been running for 6 years and I don't know you yet, there's a cost to me as well, right? I have to look at your source code and figure out, is it actually doing the right thing? Does it, change performance or stability in any meaningful way? Does it introduce new bugs or new security problems, right? And so that is what the maintainership of a project is about. It's not about just me continuing to make code on my own. It's about me also understanding how people are going to give back and how I'm going to incorporate that into my software. So, like I said, this started 50-ish years ago with just giant blocks of text called diff that would be sent across a mailing list. And then you get feedback on the mailing list in front of everybody in their email inbox about how bad your commit was. They're like, oh, your patch is garbage. You didn't indent the right way here. You should have used this other library and you used, library B instead. And we don't like library B, right? And so it was very painful to just wake up every morning into your email box and see that kind of thing. And so what happened next is this evolution away from email into networked version control, right? Because we used to have to centralize where our source code was hosted. But once a system called Subversion came around, and there were some others as well, it became easier to pull all the source code down and push my change directly into that remote repository. So now I could write into that repository and I could share a link. So I didn't have to share all the code. I could just share a link. And then there were these review tools like Review Board and Garrett, where you could just do the line-by-line diff view. If you've used GitHub, you're familiar with this kind of view where you could leave comments directly in line. And so now you're getting very targeted, very personalized feedback. It's not blowing up your email inbox. Only people that are interested in that are seeing it instead of everyone working on the project, right? And so that was kind of the second evolution that really made a lot more people comfortable contributing to open source software. And now we have GitHub. And here I'm using GitHub the same way people use like Band-Aid or Google, right? Like if you know the GitHub interface, know that there are many types of that interface of hosting my code, letting me, take pull requests, merge them in, make releases, do all that kind of work, right? And so I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with GitHub, but if you're not, you can start a repository. You can open source your own software. Other people can propose changes. You can make line-by-line comments, and it's all in one place. Your bug reports go in there as well. So your users have a bug report. They'll file the bug right in there, and then you have release management. And they've added things as they've gone along. Like now you have artifacts, and you have a container registry if you're running, if you're building Docker containers or something like that. You can actually push your runtime artifacts out through there as well. So hopefully the technology for collaborating among people to be good contributors and maintainers continues to evolve, and there are many flavors and ways to specialize that experience to whatever works best for your project, right? And so what happens when you make a change that is not appreciated or it's so big, people are like, okay, I see what you're doing, but it's basically a different project, right? There's a process called forking, which is there's a button on GitHub that says fork this, right? And that means you get a copy of the source code that you can start making your changes in. You can then publish those back. You can rename it. You can diverge greatly from the original source, right? And to me, this is the promise of open source software. A lot of people focus on getting their changes into the upstream repository, And I think that's fine. But I also think that the ability to diverge and have a differing opinion on the way things go and to be able to put the work in and see if it works out better for you or not, I think that's all very important. So I say, like, don't be shy about forking. Like, if there's something that you need to do, like, go diverge, right? Like, you don't have to be the same if you are a Home Assistant user or whatever. I'm just trying to think of like popular open source projects. Like, and you want to do something else, like, man, go do it. Go experiment. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it goes upstream, maybe it doesn't. Maybe you have to maintain your fork now. Like, all that sounds great. And just as an example, like, some of you might be Ubuntu Linux users. Some of you might be Red Hat Linux users, right? There are all these different flavors of Linux distributions. And so why are there so many when they all have the same core technology? It's because people have varying preferences. They have varying ideas about how to run projects and what their end goal and who their end users are. And so I don't think forking is a bad thing at all. So if you want to upstream your change, that's great. If you want to make a public fork, right, and allow contributions and become a maintainer of your fork, that's great. And if you just want to take something that's open source and use it internally, if the license allows that, and keep your own patches just for your own contribution, like, hey, that's awesome too. You're living the dream. That is what it is all about. And so when we talk about upstreaming, this is one of the more challenging parts because most of the maintainers of open source projects are, not doing it full time. A lot of them are not paid to do that work. And so you get a lot of variability in how quickly they respond. Do they like call you names and close your pull request without comments, or do they actually work through you with it, right? Lots of reasons that people want to get involved in understanding why a project exists and how a maintainer sees themselves interacting with that project is going to help you understand how they see your contribution into that project as well, right? And I think from, there's this kind of hierarchy of professionalism, I would say. It also happens to be hierarchy of bureaucracy, right? So if I want to make a change to, let's say David's got a project and I want to make a change to, make it blue bordered instead of red bordered, right? Some small change. I can probably just send him a PR, explain why that's a good change, and maybe it gets merged, right? But if I go to like groups of people, like a ham radio software, so I use amateur radios, and if there's a group of people maintaining a project and I want to make that same change, maybe I have to get 4 or 5 of them to agree. And there's a little bit of consensus building, but we can still use the tools that we have at our disposal in GitHub to have that conversation out in public and make that change happen, right? And then you get to where they're big projects, right? And this is like the OpenStack project that I came from, or if you're familiar with I'm trying to think of like what other good projects would be, but anything that has Kubernetes, right? Like Kubernetes is an open source software that maybe Docker users and containerized people know, right? So there are release schedules, and what goes into the releases are kind of pre-agreed, like 6 months to 8 months in advance, right? So if you're running that release schedule and you want to propose a change, like, is it going to disrupt the release schedule? Are we going to spend too much time looking at your change? Do we have to delay it for, maybe up to a year to the next release cycle, right? So this is where you get into that like foundation level organization where, taking that change is a whole process in itself, right? And so if you want to upstream a change, if you want to contribute and it doesn't happen right away, or it's hard to do, and, the amount of data they're requesting is a lot, like, don't get discouraged, like maybe fork, maybe private fork. But I think it's worth trying to contribute to other people's repositories and building those relationships, building a name for yourself, helping them know that their project is in use as well, right? So it's very frustrating to have a project that used to be popular and then you don't know if anybody's still using it anymore. Like, getting a patch can actually feel really good to maintainers as well. So with all that said about how to contribute, like, when should you start a new open source project? And I'm thinking about this from, you're working at a business as a software engineer. So when would you want to suggest to your management that you should start an open source project? My answer there, even though I have started an open source project, is almost never. So you personally should probably have an open source project or two. You have a lot of hobbies, you do fun things, you like to, make screensavers. Is that still a thing? Let's pretend screensavers are still a thing. And so you want to have this suite of screensavers that folks can use. Like, go do that. That sounds like a fun project. You're going to love doing it. It's something that you're already doing. Doing it in open isn't going to change the way that you do it, and you're going to meet some friends along the way, right? Like, it's good to have a hobby. Go do that. But if you're a company, the costs of open source can quickly overrun the benefits, right? So when you open source something, there might be reputational damage if it has a security flaw in it, right? There might be a competitive product that you didn't know about, and now people accuse you of trying to split the community, right? That's not what open source is supposed to be about, splitting community. I mean, sometimes I think it actually is, but I think most people think the community is a nice, wholesome thing all the time, everywhere, and so it's important to make it cohesive. So there are costs to it, right? Social, economic, right? Because we talked about all the things that you have to do to have a security response team and all of this, right? And so if you're a business, when do you actually want to open source your software? The way I think about it is if I have a core business product and I can expand the influence of that core product, then I would do that. So probably the most obvious use of this is a command line tool to invoke my product, or an API like library SDK to call my APIs in your favorite programming language. You know, I might build Python, Node, Java, C Sharp, Swift, right? I might build a lot of packages that talk to my software so that you can integrate it more easily in your software. So my ability to integrate with your life becomes greater. So you're getting more value out of my core product. Those are the things that I might open source. If you just really want to like be that person who gets kudos for getting things submitted to open source repositories, you want to really put on your LinkedIn resume, right? Like, I contributed 4 patches to Home Assistant in 2026, right? Like, that's a good like New Year's resolution to take. Go for it, right? There are other ways in addition to patches to help. One is if your company is using a lot of open source software, and that open source software has a foundation, you could consider joining that foundation. That pays for the maintainers and the user group meetings and all the other things that go around that entire community. If you're using a volunteer project, make financial contributions to those developers. Make sure that we have a sustainable future for people that are putting in that hard work without financial incentives, right? And another thing you can do is just volunteer for like bad work that nobody wants to do, right? Or it's hard and it burns people out, right? An example of hard work that burns people out is trying to get a release out the door, especially in these big foundation type projects where there's a 6-month schedule and they really want to hit the schedule. Kubernetes is an example, right? They have teams of maintainers for each of the Kubernetes projects to make sure that those release coordinators can drive that release to getting out on time with all the testing and packaging and translations and documentation all lined up together. And that burns people out. And if you wanted to help, man, that would be so great. You know, those are the kinds of places where you can make a difference. And, you know, share translations, create artwork. There are lots of ways to help in these projects other than just code. So figure out what's actually useful to the project in addition to what is personally fulfilling for you. So I think that was the crux of the talk that I wanted you to hear, right? So that's the how are you going to engage with open source software? So we talked about the definition of open source software, what it means to be a corporate, especially user of open source software. And then we talked about, should you be a maintainer? Should you try to contribute back? And what would that look like? So if you're not familiar with there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. That's what that acronym on the bottom stands for. And it just means that if you think something is free, it just means you're not paying financially for the direct costs. And so now, like any good thought leader, I'm going to speculate about the future. And the future in 2025 is all about artificial intelligence, right? And so I'll start with my premise, which is LLMs aren't going to kill us, right? What they're going to do is they're going to make a lot of text. Code is text. I think you can see that the line here is the LLMs are going to make so much code that we're not going to be able to keep up. We're not going to know what's good. We're not going to be deliberate about what are we open sourcing? Are we giving the right amount of time to maintain this thing that we're open sourcing? Are we splitting communities? Because we can iterate faster on code now. What are we going to do about those long pole human processes of code reviews and release planning and things like that? So I think the first thing I'm going to say, and this is completely non-controversial, is there are going to be a lot more repositories in the future of open source code that are AI produced instead of human produced, right? Even if there's a human lightly in the loop, they'll be mostly AI code, and they might be suitable for some purposes, but maybe not as robust as ones that have been through thorough review. So that is my first position. So my second position is that this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? So when I was a junior developer and I started giving back, I was not better than the AI is today, and people were still very willing to work with me, very openly on mailing lists, even if they hurt my feelings and they didn't intend to. Like, contributors aren't always good, so AI bar is not actually as high as we think it is, right? And then how do we actually manage a world where the number of repositories, increases by a factor of even 200, right? There are already more open source projects than I can keep up with, even within a certain niche, right? I can't even think about what are all the, computer vision libraries, for example. I'm sure there's probably like 80 of those, right? And different wrappers around them and ways they're integrated into other projects, right? So they're already too much projects for us to be able to reason about as humans, right? So I don't think anybody says, hey, give me every computer vision library. I'm going to roll a fair dice and like whatever position in the list comes up, that's the one I'm going to use, right? People still have selection criteria for what libraries they use. Some of those things that we talked about earlier, remember, were what is the license and can I comply with its terms? And is it actively maintained? Does it accept patches? Are there routine releases? Is there a security disclosure list? All this kind of stuff, right? So even though computers don't consume oxygen, it doesn't mean they're better or worse at making software than we are, especially in their near future. And when they make a lot more software, doesn't necessarily mean that we as consumers are worse off. Another thing that I think is going to happen, like I think about that left pad project, right? It's taking the word the and putting 3 spaces in front of it was my example from earlier, right? Like, I think most of us could write that code, right? And it's just a few lines. And so why was that a library in the first place? And so the next thing I think is that there are actually going to be fewer reusable bits of code, because when I tell an LLM what I want, I don't tell it I want a general pattern or abstraction that I can use and share among all my places. When I tell an LLM to generate code for me, I'm thinking strictly about the business value and not about a library or what I can cleave out and make its own project, right? So I actually think we're going to have a lot fewer libraries in the future, even if the total number of end user projects goes up substantially. And that's just because of the way that we instruct the LLMs to work on our behalves, right? And so the last thing here, this is maybe the most important, is that reputation systems matter a lot. The reason I know what libraries are good are because my friends tell me what libraries they use. I had a conversation earlier today at work about different database schema migration tools, Liquibase and I think a Java library versus SQL Alchemy was something I knew from doing Django projects in Python, like, decade singular ago, at least 10 years ago, right? And so we were talking about these kinds of things. And so this is one of the ways, like this just informal human gossip, this water cooler talk, right, is one of the ways that we know intuitively what libraries we should use and what's safe and reliable. And I'll also say, like, it's new. I don't have a lot of data from other people, right? But my personal experience is that, in the last 2 years of vibe coding, the newer models try to incorporate external libraries a lot less. And when they do, a lot of times they're giving you feedback on why they chose it and what alternatives might be if you want to go another route. So they're, the models have been trained to be conservative and cautious about this, right? And like even in a world where AI is helping you pick libraries, like we still know how many stars a project has on GitHub, or if any of our favorite other systems that we're using are using that same library. Or we can search source code in our company's GitHub repository or GitLab or whatever they're putting their code in. We can search and see what is already in use across the company, right? Like we're not going to lose signal about what we should trust or not. Like, is it used in textbooks? Does it have a lot of blog posts from actual humans? Who's talking about it at conferences, right? Like these are all still good signs, even when we're faced with a deluge of hundreds of new projects. I don't think it's going to be the end of the world. I think we're not going to drown in code. And I don't think there's going to be just poor libraries running around. I think the human aspect of maintaining libraries and talking about what's valuable to us will not go away. The place where I'm most optimistic, though, is that the hard part of open source can get a little bit easier, right? So when we talk about getting that documentation and image assets and translations and source code and test results all lined up and into a release, talking to new contributors about what it takes to be a new contributor and giving some of that early feedback on not just the individual code, but the process of making that code available, right? I think these are places where we can actually have AIs do a lot of work on behalf of the maintainer, right? And so maybe even automated translation, right? Maybe the release image, a lot of these things start going to AI. So some of the tasks that are sources of burnout and sources of social conflict might go away or get better in a world of AI as well. So again, I don't think that code is the most interesting part of open source as an entire ecosystem. I think to us as individual computer hackers, the code is the most important, but that's not going to go away. That's not what makes open source distinct. So it's all these other process things where we can make that better, make it more social, make it more cohesive, right? Those are the things where we should be looking to expand and make things better for our lives as people who write software and work in this industry. And we're going to be working and be friends with these folks that are maintainers whose lives are hard and thankless, and they're not getting compensated for a lot of the work that we're doing. And they're very much behind the scenes until there's a bug that they were on a project for, and then they're in the spotlight in a bad way, right? So let's be empathetic, greet people with grace, and try to figure out ways to make their lives better. So that's the end of the speculation. I will not take any financial bets about whether any of that or not is going to come true. But just food for thought for everybody. So that is the presentation that I have for today, which we got through with still enough time to take some Q&A if folks want to do that. Oh, Matt Burns has raised a hand. Look at that, very pro-social behavior. It's
absolutely. Yeah. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Sweet. Appreciate it. Hey, Todd, I'm Matt. First of all, thank you all for your contributions to OpenStack. I actually used it early this year in an Army course, and we could not have built those labs without OpenStack. So appreciate that.
Fantastic. Again, sometimes you don't know how your product is getting used. It's great to get that feedback, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and 7.3, I'm a fellow ham operator as well. So yeah, there's a few of us out here. So I have maybe a vague question, sort of from an open source, maybe like DevOps culture perspective, but I'm kind of hoping what I'm asking makes sense. But my last job was at a defense startup called Defense Unicorns. I've since left because I'm balancing full-time startup life at Defense Unicorns and then a part-time job in the National Guard. I was a DevSecOps engineer there. I worked a lot with Helm charts. Kubernetes is a very mature organization. We kind of centralize everything on GitHub. So we had our GitHub Actions for CI, wikis. We used projects for Kanban boards, and it was all in one place. And that company went on to donate to the Open Security Software Foundation, a project that they call ZARF, which was getting Kubernetes in air-gapped environments. So they did lots of cool things. I wasn't necessarily parts of those projects, but again, just sort of to give you some context for the job that I was at, and I'm now at a small fintech. I just joined a couple of months ago, and so I was hired on to do some like security changes. So like moving their AWS IAM to Entra ID, like sort of federated through there. But my real sweet spot is like working with infrastructure as code, sort of in everything as code from a security perspective. And I want to encourage that company to use more open source software. And from the security perspective, like I'm thinking about things I can put in CI/CD, like pre-commit hooks, secret scanning, SAST, IAC scanning, test coverage, SBOMs, that sort of thing. But the culture and tooling at my new job compared to Defense Unicorns is like extremely different. The new job, they use Confluence for wikis, Bitbucket for source control, Jenkins for CI. And there's also this like big gap between dev and security. So we're kind of like working from two separate sides of the circus, so to say. Like they're not so much, everyone's working together from the same single source of truth in GitHub that I was at that previous organization. Again, under the dark umbrella of Atlassian instead of open source. So what I like your perspective on is sort of like from an architectural and cultural standpoint, how can someone in my position, again, I've only been with the company for about 2 months, and so I'm kind of like the new security guy, but I'm really wanting to start to bridge that divide between the dev and the security teams. And I've been working on like culture, like sort of cultivating that relationship and then nudging them more towards like open source tools that are available out there that they don't have to pay for. Because right now the culture is like, hey, we have a need for something, just like how much do I need to pay for a license? And I'm like, well, let's see what's out there. There are a lot of reputable things out there, like with Cloud Native Computing Foundation. They have tons of like well-vetted tools that the rest of the world is using. So I don't want to come at them and they'll be like, who's this new security guy? I kind of want to like slowly incorporate all the teams working from that single pane, giving security what they need, giving the developers what they need. But like, I'm kind of struggling of like, where do I fit in to start to like bridge those gaps and get them more open-minded to open source software.
Yeah.
And I hope that wasn't too much. And it was a little all over the place, but.
No,
yeah.
it was actually great context. And so I think there are two parts of this, right? And I'm going to take the hard part and not answer it, right? Because this is my license to do that, right? So I'm going to say the part about leading change, I'm going to set that aside, right? And I'm just going to focus on the open source part of it. So I'm assuming that, and I'm happy to talk to you later about what it looks like to lead change. But I'm assuming you've got a plan to do that. And so I think what you need to do is talk about the value, right? Which you already hit on, right? There are other things that add value. I've used them. I've seen them. Here are industry reports. Here's what Gartner, the analysts are saying about open source, right? And so you can go through that and say like, the build versus buy comparison, do the math, show the work, show that it works, right? And I think when you do that and you show open source, internal versus external, the other hidden piece of this is what skill set do you want to be building among your team, right? So every manager wants to think about leveling up their team, right? How do I promote my engineers to the next level? How do I make sure they're fulfilled in learning, right? And so when you have open source, I think you get a lot more of that as well, right? Because now I'm working in source code. I'm learning something that's going to be across an entire industry, and we're not dependent on Atlassian changing their APIs or whatever to be able to make a change, right? So you own your own destiny a lot more, and you're scaling up your engineers in a way. So I think those are the two things that I would add into the conversation other than what you already have.
Perfect. That's a great answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Seems like a no.
All right. Well, David has my contact info. Talk to me over Signal. Find me on LinkedIn. Send me carrier pigeon. KQ4FID on the airwaves. Like however you want to get at me, right? Like I'm happy to talk to you all. I'm advisor for CodeU as well, and certainly happy to help everybody in Kentucky and beyond have a fulfilling time with software, because arguing with computers all day is hard, and I get that.
Yes, it is. Well, we really appreciate you, Todd. Thanks a lot for coming in, and yeah, we'll certainly have you back. No problem.
Alrighty. Have a great night, everybody.